It wasn't a knock at the door. It wasn't even a phone call. It was a single sheet of paper, slipped under the door of my apartment on a Tuesday morning while my wife was making coffee, and I was still half asleep. I remember the sound of her setting down her mug. I remember how quiet the kitchen got. The letter was from Harwick Property Group. 45 days. That was what they were giving us. 45 days to vacate a home we had lived in for 6 years. A 2-bedroom in Kitchener that we had painted ourselves, where we had brought our daughter home from the hospital, where my wife had studied for her nursing exams at the kitchen table every night for 2 years. Harwick had purchased the building the previous autumn and was converting the units to short-term rental properties. It was entirely legal. It was entirely devastating. My wife's name is Fiona. She stood in the hallway holding that letter for a long time without saying anything. When she finally looked up at me, she didn't cry. She just asked very quietly, "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. The rental market in Kitchener at that time was something close to a nightmare. A 2-bedroom comparable to ours was listing for over $2,400 a month, nearly $600 more than what we were paying under our old lease. We both worked. I was doing project coordination for a mid-sized logistics company, fully remote. Fiona was 3 shifts a week at the hospital, picking up overtime when she could. We were not struggling, but we were not floating either. We had a daughter in daycare. We had a car payment. We had done everything right, or close to it, and it still was not enough to absorb that kind of increase without something else giving way. We spent 3 weeks looking. We drove out to Cambridge, to Guelph, to the outer edges of Waterloo region, where the listings were thinner, and the commute to Fiona's hospital would have added another 40 minutes each way. Every unit we saw was either out of our range, already taken, or came with a landlord who looked us over in a way that made Fiona squeeze my hand a little tighter. The city had no room for us. That was the plain fact of it. It was my father-in-law, a man named Stuart, who called one evening in early March. Stuart lives in a small town called Mildmay, up in Bruce County, and he is not the kind of man who says much without reason. He had heard about our situation from Fiona and had been sitting with it for a while before he spoke. "There's an old place," he said, "about 4 kilometers outside of town. Been sitting empty since the Pollard estate settled. The son lives in Calgary, doesn't want anything to do with it. County's been after him to deal with it for 2 years now." He paused. "It's rough, Connor. I want to be honest with you, but the land is solid and the bones are probably fine." I asked him what rough meant. "It means you'll want rubber boots," he said. We drove up that Saturday. All 3 of us, Fiona and I and our daughter Lily, who was 2.5, and slept most of the way pressed against her car seat with her mouth open. The road that led to the property was unpaved, just hard-packed gravel and frozen mud, cutting back through a stand of old white pine and birch. When the house came into sight, I felt Fiona's hand find my knee. It was a story and a half, cedar shingles going gray, a front porch that sagged at one corner, windows boarded on the ground floor. The yard had gone completely wild. Old farm machinery rusted in the grass near the tree line, a water pump, the skeleton of what might have once been a garden shed. The roof had a visible dip on the west side that I did not like the look of, but Stuart was standing in the lane with his hands in his coat pockets, watching us the way he always does, patient, unhurried, like he already knew how the afternoon was going to go. "The lot is 2¼ acres, he said. "The well tested clean last fall. Septic is old, but the county inspector said it's functional." He looked at the house. "The price reflects the condition. The son just wants it off his hands." The asking price was $88,000. In the current market, for a property of that acreage, even in that state, it was low enough to make me careful. Things that cheap usually meant something had been missed. We walked through it. The ground floor smelled of damp and old wood and something faintly animal. The kitchen had been stripped of its appliances at some point, just bare counters and open cabinets, a hole in the wall where a range had been plumbed. The living room had original hardwood under about 30 years of grime. At the center of the space, separating the living area from the back hallway, was a massive fieldstone fireplace that ran floor to ceiling, the kind of thing you don't see built anymore, heavy and old, and clearly the heart of the house when it was first put together. Lily toddled over and put both palms flat against the stone. "Cold," she said. "Yes, baby," Fiona said. "It's cold." We put in an offer the following Monday. 45 days later, when Harwick's deadline passed, we were no longer in Kitchener. We were 4 kilometers outside of Mildmay, living out of boxes in a house that smelled like a root cellar, with a camp stove, a space heater, and a 2-year-old who thought the whole thing was an adventure. I want to be honest about those first weeks. They were hard in a way I was not fully prepared for. The roof on the west side needed more work than the inspection had suggested. 2 of the rafters were compromised, and we had to bring in a local contractor before we could do anything else, which ate through a significant portion of what we had set aside for renovations. Fiona had temporarily reduced her shifts to 3 per week while we settled in, which helped with Lily, but tightened everything else. We were heating 2 rooms effectively, and leaving the rest to fend for itself. Some mornings I would come downstairs and see my breath, but there is something that happens when you work on a house with your own hands. It's gradual and hard to name. You start to understand it differently, not as a problem, but as a project, a relationship, almost. We tore out the ground floor drywall ourselves. Every weekend, Stuart would drive over with his truck and we would load it with debris. Fiona stripped the hardwood floor in the living room over 2 weekends, and the wood underneath was better than either of us had hoped. Wide pine boards, old growth, just buried under decades of finish. I repaired the front porch. I learned how to repoint mortar by watching videos on my phone while sitting on the cold floor. The fireplace was the centerpiece of our plans. We were going to restore it, clean the chimney, make it functional. I wanted it to be the first thing you saw when you walked in. It was the most beautiful part of the house. It was in the 5th week, while I was measuring the living room for new baseboards, that I noticed something that stopped me mid-motion. I had my tape measure against the north wall and was working my way across toward the fireplace. The room measured 22 feet from the outside wall to the face of the fieldstone. Standard enough. But I had also taken an exterior measurement that morning, standing in the frozen mud with the tape along the foundation. The exterior north wall to the south exterior wall was 29 feet. The fireplace was deep, but not 7 feet deep. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and just looked at it. The fieldstone ran the full height of the wall, about 8 feet across at the base, with the firebox opening centered in it. Behind the fireplace, according to my measurements, there was somewhere between 3 and 4 feet of space that I could not account for. I knocked on the stone, which told me nothing. I went around to the back hallway and stood against the wall that should have been behind the fireplace. Drywall. I pressed my palm against it. Hollow. I cut a small inspection hole with a utility knife that evening after Lily was in bed. Fiona held the flashlight while I peeled back the drywall. "What is it?" she said. "A room," I said. It was not large, maybe 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide, running the full width of the fireplace on the back side of it, accessible only from a panel that had been drywalled over flush with the hallway wall. Someone had taken care to do it neatly, to make it invisible. The room had a concrete floor and was bone dry. Against the far wall, there was a wooden shelving unit, and on the bottom shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, was a flat metal strongbox about the size of a large briefcase. Fiona and I looked at each other in the small beam of the flashlight. "We should probably open it," she said. "We should probably open it," I agreed. The box was locked, but the lock was a simple mechanism, a luggage-style 3-digit combination that had rusted slightly. I tried the obvious sequences, 000-123, the year stamped on the foundation of the house, which I had noted was 1961. None of them worked. It was Fiona who tried the year that the previous owner, Harold Pollard, had been born, which Stuart had mentioned in passing. She had remembered it. I would not have. The box opened. Inside there was a layer of silica gel packets, dry and intact. Below them, wrapped in a second piece of oilcloth, was a collection of documents. Some were handwritten, some typed on what looked like a manual typewriter. There was a deed to the property made out to Harold Pollard, dated 1974. There was a folded survey map. And beneath all of that, rubber banded together, was a stack of papers that looked different from the rest. The paper was heavier, the format more formal, and the letterhead at the top of the first page read, Colbury Development Corporation. I sat down on the hallway floor and started reading. What I was holding, as best I could determine in the following hours. Fiona made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning going through it page by page was a set of internal financial records. They were not Harold Pollard's records. They appeared to be records that Harold Pollard had obtained, or been given, or taken, we couldn't tell which, from someone else. Someone named Elliot Marsh. Elliot Marsh was the founder, and, at the time these documents were dated, the CEO of Colbury Development Corporation, a private real estate holding company that had been active in Gray and Bruce counties through the 1980s and early 1990s. The records described a pattern of transactions that were not what they appeared to be on the surface. Municipal contracts awarded through what looked like bid manipulation, payments to entities that did not seem to exist, money moving through shell companies registered in Newfoundland and the Cayman Islands. The documents described, in the dry and careful language of financial record-keeping, something that looked very much like systematic fraud. Fraud that had been perpetrated against county governments, against small municipalities, against public infrastructure funds that were supposed to build roads and repair water systems and do the ordinary maintenance work of keeping a community functional. I did not sleep that night. In the morning I called my father-in-law. He came over within the hour, sat at our kitchen table, and looked through the documents with the slow deliberateness of a man who is taking something very seriously. Stewart had lived in Bruce County his entire life. He remembered Colbury Development. He remembered Elliot Marsh. There were always rumors, he said quietly, about the contracts, about where the money went. He set down the page he was reading. People knew something was wrong. Nobody could ever prove it. These prove it, Fiona said. Stewart looked at her, then at me, then back at the papers. Where did old Harold get these? We didn't know. We still don't. Not entirely. The best theory we eventually came to was that Harold Pollard had worked, at some point in the 80s, as a subcontractor on one of the projects Colbury was involved in, and had either been shown these records by someone inside the company or had come across them some other way and had held on to them. Why he never came forward, whether out of fear or doubt, or simply the particular silence of a man who doesn't trust that systems will work the way they're supposed to. We couldn't say. He had sealed them in that box and hidden them behind a fireplace, and eventually he had died. And the box had sat there for years in the dark, until now. We contacted a lawyer in Owen Sound, a woman who had been recommended to us by someone Fiona knew from the hospital. Her name was Annette Beaumont, and she was the kind of lawyer who listens before she speaks. We drove up on a Wednesday with the documents in a sealed envelope, Lily strapped in the back with her snack cup, the three of us looking like anyone else on the highway. Annette took her time. She asked questions. She made calls. At the end of our second meeting with her, she set down her pen and said, "These are legitimate. The question is whether the statute of limitations applies to the specific charges that could be laid, and whether there are individuals still living who can be held accountable." Elliot Marsh had died in 2009, but two of the names that appeared in the documents as co-signatories and beneficiaries of the fraudulent arrangements were still alive. One of them was a retired municipal councillor from Walkerton. The other was a man named Douglas Fenn, who had been, for the past 18 years, the managing director of a private infrastructure fund operating across 3 Ontario counties. A fund that, as Annette noted with careful precision, had received provincial government grants totaling over $40 million in the last decade alone. We handed everything over to Annette. She contacted the Ontario Provincial Police. She contacted the Provincial Ministry of Finance. The process that followed was not quick, and it was not cinematic. It was months of phone calls that we were not part of, documents we were not allowed to see, progress reports that came in small, cautious increments. We kept renovating the house. We had no other choice. The roof got finished. The kitchen got a new floor. The fireplace, that beautiful, impossible fireplace, got cleaned and restored and lit for the first time, probably, in 30 years. On the first real cold night of November, Fiona and I sat in front of it with cups of tea while Lily slept upstairs, and I thought about Harold Pollard sitting in that same room, knowing what was behind the wall, carrying that weight in silence. The investigation became public in the late spring. Douglas Fenn resigned from the Infrastructure Fund in April, before the charges were formally laid. The OPP announced the investigation in May. Provincial audit teams were dispatched to review the fund's financials. 2 other individuals were identified in the course of the investigation, neither of whom we had ever heard of. The Walkerton councillor, who was 73 and in poor health, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced arrangement. The fraud that Colbury Development had run across Bruce and Grey counties in the 1980s and early 1990s was ultimately assessed at somewhere in the range of $18 million in today's terms, money that had been taken from public works projects, from community infrastructure, from places and people who had needed it and never understood why it was always just slightly insufficient, why the roads stayed rough longer than they should have, why the water upgrades got delayed year after year. Douglas Fenn was charged with fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and conspiracy. The trial is still ongoing as I write this. In the fall of that same year, we received a letter from the Pollard estate lawyer in Calgary. The son, a man we had never met, who had sold us his father's land for $88,000 because he didn't want to deal with it, had been made aware of what we had found. He wrote a short letter, a few sentences in the careful language of someone who had consulted their own lawyer before writing. He acknowledged the significance of what we had uncovered. He did not ask for anything back. He had, he wrote, found it meaningful to know that his father had held on to those records, even if he had never been able to act on them. Annette had quietly pursued, on our behalf, a whistleblower claim through the provincial financial recovery process. It was not a guarantee. It was not something we had banked on. But in February of the following year, we received confirmation of a recovery award, a portion of the recovered funds, as provided under the Ontario Anti-Fraud Recovery Framework, directed to the individuals whose evidence had made the recovery possible. The amount changed things. Not in a dramatic way, not all at once. It paid off the mortgage on the property in full. It funded the remaining renovations without the grinding calculation we had been doing in our heads every week. It let Fiona reduce her shifts permanently to what she actually wanted to work, instead of what we needed her to work. We stayed. That is the thing I want to say most clearly. We stayed. The house looks different now. The porch is straight. The windows are uncovered, and in the evenings the light comes through the birch trees in the way that I have come to think of as the specific quality of light in that part of the province. Soft, particular, unhurried. Lily is old enough now to run the length of the yard by herself, to know the names of the trees, to press her palm against the cold fieldstone of the fireplace, the way she did the very first day, and say, with great authority, warm. I think about Harold Pollard sometimes, about the weight of knowing something and not knowing what to do with it, or not trusting that anything could be done. About the particular kind of courage it takes to preserve evidence that you may never see used in a box behind a wall on the faith that someday it might matter. It mattered, Harold. I want you to know that it did. The house is standing. The fire is going. We are not going anywhere.